Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Project Flux podcast. And today we have Noel Hurley, who is the CEO of Literal Labs, with us. Thanks for joining us on the show, Noel.
It's good to be with you.
Brilliant. And we found out just before the call that we're literally not far from each other. So really, we should have done this in person. But maybe next time we can get a
next time.
studio between Bushy and St. Albans, which would be cool. But I'm really interested in your bio, and thank you so much for sort of reaching out to come and speak to us. And this is a subject that we haven't touched on too much in this series. But before we go into what you do at Literal Labs, can you just tell us a little bit about your journey? Because you started off working for ARM, didn't you?
Well, yeah, I started off as an electronics engineer and got into doing silicon chip design.
Mm-hmm.
And as a kid, I'd used the BBC Micro, which was a very early computer in those days, and I'd become aware of ARM quite early on. And so, yeah, I joined ARM when it was about 40 people.
Oh, wow. Okay. Really early days then.
Very early days. Yeah. And then I guess I stayed with them till it was about, 650 or so. And then went off to do another startup down in Bristol called Exmos Semiconductors. And then we had a little bit of a struggle raising capital after the 2008 financial crisis.
Of course, yeah.
I left, one of the other co-founders left. And actually, long story short, one of my old bosses at ARM rang me up and said, "Noel, we're going to take on Intel in servers. Do you want to come back for the fight?" So I went back and ran their product marketing, ran the microprocessor team, ran a bunch of business segment organizations and strategy and incubation. And so when I joined them went back to them as about 1,000, 1,200. And then I left in 2022 when there were about 8,000 people. So quite an interesting journey, actually, when I look back on it, to go from ARM as a startup, do another startup, join a big corporation as it was then. And now with Literal Labs, we started that in 2023 and back to blank sheet of paper, a bit of research, and off we go again.
But with all that experience behind you, and all those lessons learned,
all those mistakes behind me.
But can I just, before we go on to Literal Labs, then, just when you started off with ARM and they were 50 people, could you foresee that they were going to become the major player that they now are? Were there some obvious signs there?
Looking back on it, at the time, no, but looking back on it now and knowing what I know now, then yes, there were some obvious signs there. There was a real clarity in terms of direction the company was going. Mm-hmm. There was real competitive spirit there. Mm-hmm. Robin Saxby, or Sir Robin Saxby, is as he later knighted, he had this when I joined, the mission was, we're going to be the number one risk processor company in the world. And this is a small organization in Cambridge in a world where, bluntly, the Americans dominated, and then you had a lot of the Japanese in that space. But that clarity of going, we're going to be number one, we're going to be number one, what are we going to do to be number one, combined with a real competitive spirit. Yeah, eventually we got there.
Yeah, and it's incredible.
What was interesting, there was a period in the middle, and actually when I left ARM the first time, arguably, looking back on it, there was a period when the company reached that goal. That was a really turbulent point for the business until it was able to then find, right, what's the next big competitive thing? And actually one of the things that attracted me to go back to that company was, as I say, my old boss saying, we're going to take on Intel in servers. We're going to take on the biggest guy in their space. And again, that's that competitive spirit that just says, yeah, we can do this. Go for it.
And it shows the UK punching well above its weight in terms of, and we keep doing it, don't we? I mean, I know we've got American listeners on, so I don't want to take sides, but it's a real testament to the power of ingenuity within the UK that we keep producing beasts like ARM. But tell us a little bit about Literal Labs then and what you do.
Yeah, so actually, I think as I've been watching AI over the last almost 6, 7, 8 years and watching the way in which industry has been responding to AI, and very much from a computational efficiency perspective, because that's, I was at ARM at the time and that's where my background comes from. When I left ARM and I was doing various consulting work and working for various companies, I just came across this team in Newcastle that had been working on this logic-based approach to AI, which put simplistically, what you're trying to do is remove as much of the multiplication out of the AI. algorithms as possible. And the advantage of doing that is that you end up with models that are super efficient and fast, very energy efficient. And I've been looking at this market thinking, I'm not sure how far the current trajectory can go around neural networks.
Mhm.
And we've seen that start to play out over the last 2-3 years.
Oh, there was
They're pushing the boundaries. And actually, the biggest chips produced in the world are for AI. They burn colossal amounts of energy. And the fundamental reason for that is they use enormous amounts of multiplication. And multiplication is an expensive circuit. It's a big circuit that burns lots of power. So if we can avoid that, then I looked at this and thought, we've got a fundamental advantage that actually people will struggle to compete with.
Yeah, it's interesting. Before we go on to the next question, I read a piece by Gary Marcus this weekend who's saying the same thing. LLMs on their own aren't enough. We're going to reach some kind of limit on that, and we need to find a different way of approaching if we are ever going to get to AGI. But we'll cover that more later.
Yeah. Well, often science engineering mimics nature. And when the whole point of artificial intelligence and neural networks is I'm trying to look at neurons structures in the brain and trying to replicate those structures in the brain. But actually, they're not the only structures in the brain. The brain is made up of many different types of structures that all interwork with each other. So when I'm looking at literal labs and our approaches that we're taking today, I can see a world where, there's going to be neural networks, but there's also going to be logic-based approaches that sit on top of that. There are going to be as yet undefined, unexplored approaches that are going to be added into that. Inevitably over time, you start to bolt the best parts together to create, 1 and 1 equals 3.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a much bigger system. I saw on the literal labs, the site said, the first thing that caught my eye was it was much more energy efficient, and I guess to some extent more traceable than neural networks. I also saw the mention of settling machines. Can you just explain if I spelled it right or said it right, settling machines, what they are and kind of to the audience?
Yeah. So I've started to touch on this with, we've all seen the pictures of interconnected networks, often used as when you're trying to explain what a neural network is. I've got this node and I've got lots and lots and lots of different interconnections to it. And the audience will have heard of, weights in association with AI and how you multiply data with weights and through these structures. And that's my point. There's an awful lot of multiplication that goes through it. What a settling machine does, actually, what we start with is something called propositional logic. You can think of it as if-then statements. It's a huge number of if-then statements. So that's what makes up our models. We've got these if-then statements. And a settling machine is really the voting algorithm. And so when we're training this network of if-then statements, what we're doing is we are voting positively and negatively to work out which of those if-then statements we include, which ones we actively exclude, and which ones we ignore. And so we go through the same training reinforcement type training processes that a neural network would go through, but the model at the end of it is a long nest of logic, not a huge amount of matrix multiplication.
Does that reduction of multiplication through these if-then kind of statements, is that a biomimicry of the brain itself? You said you were looking into neural networks, or is that something which you've figured out yourselves in terms of which is a lot more efficient?
What we're able to do is use a lot of the learnings that have come from training of neural networks, and we apply them into these logic-based structures. As I say, the machine is a type of learning algorithm. This is this sort of forefront. This was the origins of AI. Mikhail Setling and Graham Moore. Graham Moore is the US father of AI. You'll see on our website there's pictures of Setling and Moore together in Russia. I mean, Setling was going down the automata route and the sort of, rat brain type learning. And actually, a lot of his work, a guy in Norway who runs the Center for AI Research in Norway, came across Setling's work and made the leap to say, actually, it's not about training a rat's brain with reward and penalty, but many, many thousands of those brains. And
Okay.
that's where the settling machine came up. Actually, as we've evolved in terms of our technology, and if you think about things like cloud compute and just compute generally, we don't have a single computer now. We have clouds of these compute resources. And so in many ways, we scale that way. And that's how you can start to tackle ever increasingly difficult problems, because you don't have a single, just like a neural network. So you don't have a single neuron. We have many, many thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of neurons.
So I guess you see new emergent properties, right, from the bigger scale.
Yeah. So exactly, more opportunity to take a core concept and multiply it up into really quite complex machines. And just again, like a neural network, the approaches that we take is, there's not one layer, there's multi-layers, and different layers do different parts. So you can build up really quite complex. But what we do is we keep it at a logic level.
Okay. I mean, maybe I've got the wrong end of the stick, but it sounds like a cross between a neural network and a decision tree, in that it's, you've got some kind of logic within it.
We often talk about, so it's sort of decision trees on steroids.
Yeah.
And one of the challenges with decision trees, and why decision trees sort of came to a halt, but got somewhat limited in their adoption, is the training. And actually, we're able to apply modern techniques to that and take it to the next level.
Really interesting. Going back to what we were talking about before in terms of the sort of the scaling problem, and there's two schools of thought as far as I can see. There's those who think you just chuck more compute at these large language models as they stand, and eventually will break into some kind of new paradigm. And then there's others, and I think they're coming more and more. Richard Sutton being one of those, saying it will only get you so far, and actually we need some kind of new architecture. I presume I know where you stand by the fact of what you're doing, but could you explain why you think the second hypothesis? I'm assuming that you think the second hypothesis is more likely. Why that's more likely?
I think I actually came at this less from a technology perspective and much more from a business perspective, because to a certain extent, businesses do not and should not care what the underlying architecture is. My gamble is that actually for most of my customers, they won't give a damn. They're only interested in the results. And as you can see from our website, we're creating models that are orders of magnitude lower energy, orders of magnitude faster. And we have this nascent quality that I think will become increasingly important, which is the ability to also explain how the model works and offer a degree of validation and explainability to the model. And I think that will become increasingly important over time. And so for us, our objective as a business is to be able to put that capability in the hands of our customers. So, for example, actually, we talked a little bit about the technology. The product that we're bringing into the market is a tooling product that will allow our customers, a reasonably competent software engineer, to create these logic-based models using their own data sets, train their own models that will be specific to their challenge. And therefore get the advantages of faster, lower energy, more computationally efficient.
Can you give us a use case of how people are currently using some of these models?
Right now, we started off looking at the edge AI market, and that is about deploying onto silicon chips that exist today in various price points in the marketplace. So everything from $5 chips to $100 chips, that kind of space. And the reason we went after that market initially is these are the kinds of applications where you have energy constraints, you have cost constraints, you have to deal with the silicon that's available there. You can't afford expensive NVIDIA servers in those kinds of environments. And so we're looking at utilities companies that want to deploy sensors into the fields. They want to be able to use the live data that's in field and then have AI and machine learning models running on those to create things like early warning systems, to create metadata that they would then use as part of the way in which they manage their network, rather than always just shipping raw data to a cloud and doing the AI there. It doesn't fit in all of those environments, and it's an expensive way of doing it. Because of our computational efficiency, we're able to go into those markets. Now, what has emerged as we mature our technology, build our scale and capability for our tooling, is another market that's coming to the fore, which is decision intelligence market. So now that I've got all this data from live in-field data and I've brought it in-house, how do I now create predictions and insights from that data that would then feed what strategies I should deploy in terms of managing utilities, managing whatever aspect of your business? So we're seeing applications in things like logistics, utilities, those kinds of markets right now.
What about construction? Because we've got a lot of people who listen to the show who will be in construction or energy or infrastructure projects.
Just on that.
I can see it being equally as applicable in that space, especially in those smart, complex building and construction projects, but also smart buildings, those types of environments where you want I'm looking across my room, you want the thermostat to be feeding, and maybe it's combining with something else to give some kind of metadata in terms of occupancy levels, or combined with CO2, whatever, and how I manage my ventilation. I don't know. I'm making it up now. But you can see I've got all of these sensors feeding data, and then there's a higher level, which is, okay, so what strategies should I deploy to most efficiently run this asset?
Because you mentioned it there as well, like a really big issue that we have in construction, because there's so much complexity, is traceability. And I think, this is why when you said, the two things that you can see is cost efficiency, but also traceability.
And that's so important.
And that's really important for you because, we're seeing a lot of hallucinations with neural networks. Just cost estimating, for instance, you can have different outcomes every time you feed the same data in. And just knowing how the AI come to its decision is, the biggest stumbling block that we're finding at the moment.
Yes. Neural networks suffer with things like drift as well. So as you mentioned, the networks making different decisions given the same data. And that might be acceptable in some scenarios, but actually in most of these kinds of situations, no. When I give it a set of data, I want to validate that I'm always going to get that answer, and I want to know why. Now, there's one of the challenges with explainability is how you represent it. And actually because you can't get away from the fact that these models are complicated. This is not a simple, single if-then answer. No, it's hundreds, thousands of if-thens. And therefore it is naturally complex. But there is research papers. I know Cardiff University have used settler machines on things like sepsis prediction. Okay. And so what they were able to do is there's, 20 plus markers that a physician would understand, and they're able to do a model, predict sepsis, and sort of say, right, we're predicting sepsis because of the inclusion of the following markers and the absence of these markers. And so what they've been able to do is actually create something that a physician can read and say, yeah, that makes sense to me. Why you're doing that. And so that's one of the challenges with explainability. It's quite vertically centric. So in that building, it has to be somebody that, a construction manager can look at, read, and kind of go, right, that makes sense. Or build it, or utility management, person would be able to read it and kind of go, right, okay, I understand.
But the one thing then, now quickly for me is, because you mentioned it's like James said, it's a bit like a decision tree on steroids, right? And you have these if and then statements. What happens when the model is given information where it's not quite clear as to what route you go down, if or then? How do you deal with that sort of uncertainty?
Well, look, all models have an accuracy level, right? So if we're talking about classification, you tend to vote and go for whichever classification the model gets the highest number of votes. But there's going to be an error margin to that, and there's an understanding of that. But I think, and that's where I am actually not in the camp of, there's going to be this universal intelligent machine that is just going to run everything. I think actually it requires either multiple machines voting against each other and or humans in the process as well. But, in the same way, actually, the machine is not always right. And I think there is a slight bias in humanity where you believe the machine is correct and it's not always correct. And I think that's something that we're going to have to learn. But equally, humans aren't correct either. So there's always,
it goes both ways, doesn't it? 100%.
Mistakes made, right? There's always, judgment calls, and that's why we pay people sums of money to make that judgment call and stand by it and correct it if it's wrong.
Interesting you say that, because that's one of the big themes, particularly for people listening, is, what is this going to mean for my job? And actually that you kind of back that up. There's always going to be a human in the loop having to make a decision, because these machines are never going to be 100% and they are going to hallucinate to some extent, even though we're solving it. But someone has to, at the end of the day, given the data that they've got, make some kind of decision. So I think that will be sort of good news for a lot of people listening. But in terms of moving on to like project delivery and what AI is going to mean for the future project delivery and the future work, I guess, how do you see AI, and not just your approach, but generally the approach that's happening throughout the world, how do you see it changing the way projects delivered? Not just construction projects, IT projects, infrastructure projects, energy projects. Do you think if we look back in 10 years' time, things are going to be totally different? Or do you think it's just going to be that kind of 20% improvement on efficiency?
And this is a topic that we've been having conversations on internally, and as right in the forefront, which is what is the future of work in this whole AI space. And for me, I'm very keen that at Literal Labs we have a purpose statement that says that we're going to do, or part of our purpose statement is that AI that is good for all, right? So, we're taking that quite seriously. Looking into this, I'm driving Literal Labs much more towards how do we deploy AI into the growth side of an equation for business, rather than just on the cost-cutting side. And I think as we go down the decision intelligence route, where what we want to do is drive towards gaining and giving businesses better insights into their business, giving them predictions around their business as a means of assisting management to make better decisions and drive growth within their business. I think that is a more rewarding, more fulfilling direction than building a chat bot to get rid of, a bunch of customer service engineers, for example. Yeah. And in fact, I've been reading recently a guy called Carl Benedict Frey on the future of work. And he has a really interesting perspective, which is historically growth has come from discovery more than automation. And that his hypothesis is a lot of the AI that we see today is just automation. We're automating human tasks, but that's not going to be the direction that's going to give us productivity growth. Productivity growth comes from discovery and from, driving new insights.
Yeah, that's very similar to what I heard from Professor Richard Susskind, who says that, there's these 20% efficiency gains that you can do, and you should do, there's no harm in doing those. But the bigger question is, what is this going to mean for your particular industry? And he uses the analogy of, when you go to B&Q and you buy a drill, what you buy, you're not buying a drill, you're buying a hole in the wall. And it's the outcome. And people need to look much more at their businesses, at the outcome they're trying to achieve, and how AI can help that, which I thought was a really interesting perspective.
Yeah, I mean, when I sit down and sort of, had a rant with my wife the other day, who's also doing, she's doing AI in education. She's doing a master's in it, UCL.
Oh, that's interesting.
And I had a rant with her the other day because I'm just seeing my inbox is now starting to fill with, chat GPT, emails that are now longer than they need to be, more difficult to read, bigger than they need to be. That's not productivity improvement.
No.
That is actually a productivity drain. So what am I going to do? I'm going to use another, AI bot to then filter the AI. None of this is leading to productivity improvements.
No, it's
And
so
so
true.
where I'm focusing the business is how can we make real productivity improvements? How can we get real information out to businesses, allow them to do their predictions, and feed that into the whole decision making of how we drive any business forward. And I expect with any kind of project management, it's going to be the same thing as well. I'm not sure having longer but beautifully crafted management reports is really a productivity gain. Actually, finding those opportunities to shave time off projects, identify quickly where something's going off task. That's where you'll get your productivity improvement.
And it's funny you mentioned that, Noel, because in the AI space today, there's so much abstraction, there's so much information that project managers need to work with. And, they're experimenting with AI, but there's not always a clear idea of where to start and what information to follow and what tools to use. So if you were to advise a project leader today, how would you advise them on how they could start experimenting with AI?
I mean, I would definitely start with your open AIs and your chatbots if you really want, because it's easy, and start to play with a skeptic eye and really understand how they work. I think that is worth doing, because these are useful tools, but you need to know also where the limitations are. See, one of the challenges is the output sounds so convincing, people are convinced, but it's often wrong, factually wrong. So, but I do think it's worth starting down that route and starting to play and really understand and experiment with how you drive these chatbots beyond just simple questions. But, it's a great example of a guy that, you can who put commands in his LinkedIn profile.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know whether you saw that. He put commands in his LinkedIn profile, which basically meant that any chatbots that were scraping LinkedIn for jobs sent him, flan recipes.
I saw that, yeah.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Creative.
But the point is that actually these are machines that can be directed. And if you understand how those machines work, then that's worth playing with. I think from our side, as I say, we engage with customers. We'll be bringing out tools later on this year. We are at that early stage. We'll bring out tools, and then for us, it's all about, so what data have you got? What predictions do you want to make? And let's build you models that are going to predict going forward or classify actions going forward.
So are your models, they're much more deterministic, are they, in terms of you ask it the same? Because that's the big problem I think I find in project delivery, is that because it's probabilistic, these models, you can't, that's where the explainability goes. And actually you're dealing with stuff that you should be able to explain because you're dealing with real data. So if you've got something with literal labs that is going to provide that deterministic response, I think that is going to go a long way to answering a lot of the problems that people have with some of these models for the more kind of for the tasks, obviously not for your marketing to when you want to get some marketing copy, but I'm talking about the kind of tasks where you're relying on very specific data and you want to be sure that every time you ask that query you get the same response. So that's great.
Yeah, and not just that, you can't, no project managers want to stand in front of the clients, make the following proposal, and when asked the basic question, says, "Well, that's what the computer said." Yeah. I mean, that's not, that's not a good look either, right? So, having a degree of understanding of why that model is suggesting, I think, is essential.
Yeah.
At the end of the day.
Well, the RICS, who are the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors, they just released their guidance for all surveyors worldwide about responsible use of AI. And the big theme through it is around explainability. So people are now, these institutions are now starting to build that into professional responsibility. And I think, I'm sure there's the same with lawyers. I mean, it's obvious, really. If you're a professional lawyer or professional surveyor, you need to be sure that when a client asks you a question, you can explain it. And I do worry sometimes that skill's going away. People are saying, "Oh, well, that's what ChatGPT says."
Yeah.
That's not a good place to be. So, but before we I do want to ask a couple more things before we wrap up. This wasn't in the script, but I do want to ask your opinion about it, really, which was physical AI and humanoid robots. What's your opinion on that? Because for construction, when I'm dealing with the consultants, it's obviously really interesting with what's happening with the chatbots and what have you. But for on-site, to me, it feels like a really huge opportunity to change how we actually build the buildings and build the roads. Do you think this is close, or do you think we're quite a long way off having these?
I think I am. My gut reaction was, yeah, we're really close, and I say we're really close because I remember many years ago going to Japan, watching welding robots, going up and down metal structures, building rise buildings as they went up, and that was entirely robotic, the way the building was built. So that technology is there. What's interesting though is why are not all buildings built like that? Because that technology is really, really expensive, actually.
Yeah.
And in many cases, humans do a better job. And I think one of the challenges with all robot computer-based systems is energy efficiency. Humans are incredibly efficient machines themselves. If you think about years ago, I did a talk on, if you remember, DeepMind brought out AlphaGo, which was a computer that played Go, and it beat Lee Sedol, who was the world champion at Go at the time.
The documentary on that is brilliant on Netflix.
But when you do the energy calculations on that, so a game of Go is about 4 hours. Lee Sedol will have consumed in the order of 3/4 of a Big Mac of energy for the human. When you do the calculation for AlphaGo at that stage, it's about 3,000 Big Macs worth of energy.
Oh my God, really? Okay.
So you can see there's orders and orders of magnitude greater energy efficiency in terms of humans doing work. And so I think from a physical side, that's one of the challenges to overcome is just those systems aren't as energy efficient
and
as biological systems.
And that's because the
so
brain
there's still a place for humans, right? So that's the good news.
That's good news, yeah.
But machines they're repetitive, they work 24/7, they don't get tired, they don't argue, they don't fall out with each other. So there are pros and cons.
There's a place for both in this future
So we
work.
saw in it, because I mentioned to James a few months ago, about last year, there was a company, Final Spark, which were powering large language models off of brain organoids. Now, they were incredibly efficient, but they were only lasting about 100 days before they were kind of dying out. So there was the ethical question. But taking this into like a geopolitical vantage point, that people feel like we're in an AI bubble at the moment because there's so much going on, but we also see some of the plateaus. There's an exponential growth, but equally in terms of intelligence, there's saturation of benchmarks. And now people are having it when they look at AI, they're looking at neural networks, they're looking at large language models and these sort of things. And it feels like there's a bit of a multipolar trap, right? We're kind of forced in this attractor state where we have to build into large language models, and China are doing it, the US are doing it. Do you feel like the UK will just follow suit on that trajectory? Because, what you're doing is very different. You're probing the fitness landscape, you're bringing new technologies in. But do you think that there's pressure to follow the bandwagon from a UK standpoint?
Yeah, I think geopolitically, yes. There is effectively you have to be in the game, because I think as we look at, unfortunately, when you look at things like the Ukraine war, this is an AI image processing battlefield with autonomous machines fighting, and so at a national security level, then you need to be in that game, because if you're not, then you're not going to be able to provide safe defense for the country. So there's an element of having to be in that game. But I do think we're in the early days. And right now we're in the early part of the race. And right now I'd say the US have the lead in that space. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that's always going to be the case. They have invested huge amounts of money. When you look at companies like OpenAI, I think the last time I saw it, they're trading off 75 times their ARR, which is an extraordinary multiple.
It's crazy, isn't it?
To have. And so that's going to put it also extraordinary pressures on them, because that's only sustainable for a period of time. What we're trying to do is I'm trying to solve real problems that I think companies have. And building a organization and building a company that has got absolutely solid foundations, so has longevity. I'm somewhat concerned that Europe is playing into a little bit of the trope of, frankly, decisions take too long. They're focused on regulation, but actually you need to have regulation's important, but you need to have the innovation. There needs to be probably more invested on the innovation side and a bit more freedom given on the innovation side to match the regulation. So it's going to be an inverted commas interesting period, I think, for greater Europe, UK, Europe, and the whole continent
Definitely.
during this period around this technology.
Feels like we're walking a bit of a tightrope between getting the regulation right, but not falling too far behind. And, Arm's a great example of, a company who does punch above its weight. And then I think if you went back to the beginning of the sort of mobile era, you wouldn't have been able to say that ARM was going to be powering most of those devices. So it's very unpredictable. Who knows? Yeah. We'll look back at, I'm sure there'll be at least a few things that we look back on and go, wow, I didn't see that coming. Yes. So, and maybe Little Labs will be one of those.
Well, hopefully.
Yeah.
That's our plan.
Absolutely. Just before we wrap up, just a couple of questions, more kind of light-hearted questions, really, just that we like to find a little bit about you and get a little bit of advice as well, I suppose. So one of the questions, I'm going to ask one question and then Yoshi's going to ask a question. The first one is around your phone. So a lot of these, the way we kind of work with AI is through our apps and what have you. If you had to delete every app from your phone, but you were allowed to keep 3, which ones would you keep?
Oh, wow. So I think, keeping your life together, I think you'd need a browser, you'd need your email, and then I'd probably add Strava onto that for my cycling.
Well, okay. For your cycle, so that's interesting. That's a good balance, I think.
Yeah, I think if I had Strava, a browser, an email, it'd be sorted. In fact, I could probably just do that now.
Yeah, make things a lot simpler. I think you're right. Everyone will keep your browser and the other one, and then the third one would be your personal, whatever your personal interest is.
Second question, Noel. When you look back 10 years from now, what do you want people to say about what you built at Literal Labs?
I think, well, certainly what we're trying to build is a multinational. We're trying to build a company that has a significant presence in the world. But I think the thing I would hope that certainly most of the customers and people recognize us for is being a trusted partner in their business. I think that's so important. And some of that I learned from ARM. Actually, one of the ways in which ARM won commerce was that it built trust, and customers trusted us. We worked closely with them, and that meant that you could get through all of the ups and downs. Inevitably, when something is delayed or there's a price squeeze on something, that's when those qualities of trust come through, and that's what keeps you going as a business. Is that trust that you built up.
Trust has always been important, but I think in this world we're moving into, where you're just not sure what's real anymore, trust is going to become probably the number one value that you look for in a partner. That's fantastic, Noel. Thank you so much. Well, is there anything else you want to bring up that we haven't talked about?
No, I think that was a great conversation.
No, and we thank you so much for your time.
Both.
But where can people find out more about you and Literal Labs? Presumably you're on LinkedIn, so we can.
We are literal-labs.ai, and you can find me on LinkedIn.
Brilliant. We'll put both of those on the show notes so people can click through and continue the conversation, I guess. But for now, Noel, thank you so much for your time. It's been a really, really interesting conversation. It's been a pleasure to have you on.
Bye now.
Project Flux is here.
That's a wrap for today's episode. But before you go, exciting news. Project Flux is teaming up with Project Management Global to bring you the latest in AI-driven project delivery and essential management insights. Through this partnership, expect weekly AI insights, practical tools, and expert thought leadership, ensuring you stay ahead in the evolving project landscape. Stay tuned for exclusive content, joint research, and strategies to supercharge your project outcomes. You can learn more at www.pm-global.co.uk and be part of the future of project management. See you later.
Project Flux is here.
Just want to give a big shout out to our sponsors, Construct AI. For anyone interested in looking at Construct AI, the link's in our show notes. There's a free tier that you can play around with. Yoshi and I have been using it for a good year since it was originally launched,
and we get a huge amount of value out of it. So I thoroughly encourage everyone to go onto the Construct AI site and have a play around.
Cool. And guys, before we sign off, please don't forget to share, follow, and like all of our stuff. So that helps us to engage with you and understand a bit more about what you want so we can bring it to your doorstep as early as possible.
See you later, everyone.